When Officer James Hart, notorious for his history of abusing power, encounters a black disabled woman in a quiet park, he could never have imagined that his cruel actions would lead to something beyond his understanding. After viciously kicking her emotional support dog, strange and inexplicable forces begin to torment him. What started as an abuse of power soon spirals into a tale of eerie justice and vengeance. The racist officer quickly learns that some people are protected by forces he can't begin to comprehend. Don't forget to like and comment where you are from. The encounter. It was a calm afternoon in Maplewood Park, the kind of day when the sun filters through the trees and casts golden patches on the ground. Miriam Carter, a 62-year-old black woman who navigated life in a wheelchair, enjoyed this serene moment daily with her emotional support dog, Max. Max, a well-trained golden retriever, was more than just a pet. He was her loyal companion and protector since her husband's passing years ago. As Miriam wheeled herself down the shaded pathway, Max trotted beside her, his leash securely attached to the armrest of her wheelchair. She hummed softly to herself, soaking in the beauty of the day, when a sharp, commanding voice shattered the peace. "Hey, you, stop right there." The voice was cold, authoritarian, and filled with unwarranted hostility. Miriam stopped her wheelchair and turned toward the source of the voice, her heart sinking. It was Officer James Hart, a man infamous in the town of Pinewood for his aggressive behavior and thinly veiled racism. His towering frame and stern glare intimidated many, but Miriam kept her composure, though Max instinctively stepped closer to her side. Hart stormed toward her, his boots crunching loudly against the gravel path. His eyes zeroed in on Max, who wagged his tail cautiously but remained alert. "What's this? You know dogs aren't allowed here without proper control," he snapped, pointing at Max. Miriam frowned, her voice steady but polite. "Officer, Max is on a leash and he's my emotional support animal. I have every right to be here." Hart sneered, ignoring her explanation. "Doesn't matter. People like you think the rules don't apply to them." His tone dripped with disdain as his gaze shifted to Miriam's wheelchair, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. "Besides, he doesn't look so supportive to me." Max growled softly, sensing the hostility in Hart's voice. Miriam reached down to gently pat his head, a silent reassurance that everything would be fine. "Please, officer, we're not bothering anyone. Max is well trained, and we're just taking a peaceful walk." But Hart wasn't interested in reason. To him, Miriam's calm demeanor and polite responses were acts of defiance. His expression darkened, and without warning, he raised his foot and delivered a brutal kick to Max's side, sending the dog yelping in pain. Miriam gasped in horror. "Stop! What are you doing?" she cried, her voice trembling with shock and anger. Max scrambled to his feet, shaken but unyielding. He placed himself firmly in front of Miriam, his eyes fixed on Hart, who now stood towering over both of them. Hart chuckled mockingly, dusting off his boot as though he'd stepped in something unpleasant. "Control your mutt, or next time it'll be worse," he spat, turning on his heel as if the encounter was beneath him. Miriam's hands gripped the wheels of her chair tightly, her mind racing. Anger, fear, and disbelief churned inside her. She whispered softly to Max, soothing the trembling dog. "It's okay, boy, he won't get away with this." As Hart walked away, a strange stillness seemed to settle over the park. The birds that had been chirping moments ago had gone silent, and the air felt heavier. Miriam sat quietly, her face resolute, as if calling upon a strength no one could see. Unbeknownst to Officer Hart, this encounter was only the beginning of a chain of events that would force him to confront something far more terrifying than his own prejudice. The awakening Officer Hart walked briskly back to his patrol car, smug satisfaction plastered on his face. The confrontation with Miriam had been just another instance where he could assert his authority, another opportunity to remind someone of their place. He believed the incident was over, just a brief annoyance in his otherwise uneventful day. But what Hart didn't realize was that he had stirred forces far beyond his understanding. As Miriam wheeled herself back to her modest home on the outskirts of Pinewood, her face remained calm, but her mind was ablaze with memories and emotions. The ache of injustice had become an all-too-familiar companion throughout her life, But this time, it felt different. This time, it wasn't just about her, it was about Max, the loyal companion who had stood by her through thick and thin. His quiet whimpers as she soothed him were more than she could bear. Once inside her home, she closed the door and set her bag down on the small wooden table in the living room. Max lay at her feet, his body still trembling slightly, but his eyes fixed on her. Miriam reached down, stroking his fur gently. "You've always protected me, Max," she whispered. "Now it's my turn to protect you." Her words hung in the air, heavy with a quiet resolve. Miriam wheeled herself into the study, a small room filled with books, family photos, and an assortment of strange, antique trinkets. At the center of the room stood an old oak cabinet, its surface polished smooth by decades of care. She hesitated for a moment, her hand hovering over the brass handle before finally opening it. Inside, nestled among dusty volumes and worn artifacts, was a leather-bound book. Its cover was engraved with intricate patterns that seemed to shimmer faintly in the dim light. Miriam ran her fingers over the cover, a mix of apprehension and determination in her eyes. "I never thought I'd have to open this again," she murmured, her voice barely audible. The book had been passed down through generations of her family, an heirloom from an ancestor shrouded in mystery and whispered tales of power. Her grandmother had called it the Covenant, a guide to the ancient pacts her bloodline had forged with forces beyond mortal comprehension. Miriam had always treated it with a mixture of reverence and fear, a relic of a past she had no desire to delve into. But now, sitting in her quiet home with Max's whimpers echoing in her ears, she knew she couldn't avoid it any longer. As she opened the book, a faint, earthy aroma filled the air, as though the pages themselves were alive with time. The handwriting inside was neat yet ornate, the ink faded but legible. Symbols, instructions, and warnings were scrawled across the pages, interspersed with cryptic notes in her grandmother's hand. Miriam skimmed the text, her fingers trembling slightly. She had only ever glanced at it before, out of curiosity when she was a girl. Her grandmother's stern warning came back to her now, as clear as if it had been spoken aloud. "This book is not a toy, Miriam. It carries the weight of our family's past. If you ever use it, make sure your heart is pure or the cost will be unbearable." Her eyes stopped on a page adorned with a detailed sketch of a wolf, its mouth open in a silent snarl, surrounded by arcane symbols. The title read, "The Pact of the Guardian." Beneath it, an inscription caught her attention. "In times of peril, call upon the bond forged through blood and trust. The Guardian shall rise, loyal and unyielding, to shield and avenge." Miriam's gaze shifted to Max, who had risen to his feet despite his injuries. His eyes were locked on her, filled with an almost human understanding. She nodded slowly, her decision solidified. Taking a deep breath, she read the instructions carefully. The ritual required a simple offering, something tied to her emotions and intent. She reached for a small locket around her neck, a keepsake that held a photo of her late husband. It was the most precious thing she owned, a symbol of her love and strength. With deliberate care, Miriam placed the locket on the table beside the book. She closed her eyes and began to recite the words written on the page, her voice trembling at first, but growing steadier with each syllable. The air around her seemed to shift, growing heavier, charged with a strange energy that prickled her skin. Max stood at attention, his ears perked and his tail still. His injuries seemed to bother him less as the room filled with an eerie hum, a sound that seemed to resonate deep within Miriam's chest. The candlelight flickered wildly, casting shadows that danced across the walls. When she finished the incantation, there was a moment of absolute stillness. The hum faded, and for a fleeting second Miriam thought nothing had happened. But then Max let out a low growl, his eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. The room seemed to pulse with a strange warmth, and Miriam felt a wave of reassurance wash over her. She didn't fully understand what she had done, but she knew she had awakened something that would protect her and Max from further harm. Miriam stroked Max's fur again, this time feeling an almost electric charge beneath her fingers. "We'll get through this, boy," she said softly. "They won't hurt us again." Outside, the night deepened. Unbeknownst to Miriam, The energy she had unleashed rippled through the small town of Pinewood like a silent alarm. Whispers of unease drifted through the air, and even Officer Hart, sitting smugly in his patrol car, felt a strange chill crawl up his spine. The bond had been formed, and the reckoning was only just beginning. The first signs. The morning after Miriam's ritual dawned with an unusual stillness in Pinewood. A dense fog clung to the streets, muffling the sounds of the waking town. For most residents, it was just another quiet day in their sleepy community. But for Officer Hart, the unease from the previous night hadn't subsided. Sitting in his patrol car outside the station, Hart sipped his coffee, staring out into the haze. The satisfaction he'd felt from intimidating Miriam had begun to sour, replaced by a gnawing irritation he couldn't quite place. He tried to shrug it off, chalking it up to a restless night. Yet deep down, something told him that the events of yesterday were far from over. Across town, Miriam stood at her kitchen window, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. Max sat by her feet, his wounds nearly healed overnight. He seemed stronger somehow, his coat glossier and his movements more fluid. Miriam watched as he padded to the door, sniffing the air and letting out a low growl. "What is it, boy?" she asked, setting her mug down. Max didn't respond. He simply stared at the door, his body tense. Miriam's stomach churned as she felt the same strange energy from the night before lingering in the air. It was as though the world had shifted slightly, tilting on an axis only she and Max could perceive. A sharp knock on the door made her jump. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob before she pulled it open. It was Mrs. Henderson, Miriam's elderly neighbor. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with worry. "Miriam," she whispered, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "Something strange happened last night." "What do you mean?" Miriam asked, stepping aside to let her in. "I was out walking my dog near the woods," Mrs. Henderson began, her voice trembling. "I heard this sound, like a howl, but not from any animal I've ever heard before. It was otherworldly." Miriam's chest tightened. "What time was this?" "A little after midnight," Mrs. Henderson replied. "And then this morning I found these footprints near my garden. They're too big for a dog or a coyote. I don't know what's going on, but I thought you should know." Miriam nodded, her mind racing. She thanked Mrs. Henderson and promised to keep an eye out. As soon as the door closed, she turned to Max. "Do you think it's connected to the ritual?" she murmured. Max stared at her, his glowing eyes conveying an unspoken understanding. He stood and trotted to the door, pawing at it gently. "You want to go out?" Miriam asked. "All right, let's see what we're dealing with." Meanwhile, at the station, Hart's day was about to take a turn. As he reviewed his shift notes, a fellow officer approached him, holding a report with an amused grin. "You're not going to believe this," the officer said, handing him the paper. Hart scanned the report, his brow furrowing. "What is this?" "Calls came in early this morning," the officer replied. "Several locals reporting strange noises near the woods. Some even claimed they saw a glowing animal. Probably just some overactive imaginations, but it's making the rounds." Hart scowled. "Glowing animal? Sounds like someone's been hitting the bottle too early." "Maybe," the officer shrugged, "but it's got folks spooked." Hart dismissed him with a wave, but the report left him uneasy. He couldn't help but think of the eerie sensation he'd felt the night before. As much as he wanted to laugh it off, a small voice in the back of his mind whispered that there was more to this than idle gossip. Back at the woods, Miriam and Max walked along the familiar trails, their steps muffled by the thick carpet of fallen leaves. The air was heavy with moisture, the fog clinging to the trees like a living thing. Max led the way, his nose to the ground, his movements deliberate. Miriam followed closely, her heart pounding. She felt exposed, as though unseen eyes were watching her every move. She kept her hands tucked into her coat pockets, her fingers brushing against the edge of the locket she had sacrificed in the ritual. Max stopped abruptly, his ears pricking up. A low growl rumbled from his chest as he stared into the dense underbrush. "What is it?" Miriam whispered, squinting into the shadows. Then she saw them. Footprints. They were massive, larger than any animal tracks she'd ever seen, and they glowed faintly in the dim light. The sight sent a shiver down her spine. Max barked once, loud and sharp, breaking the silence. The sound echoed through the woods, and for a moment, everything seemed to hold its breath. Then from deep within the forest, a low, guttural growl answered. Miriam froze, her blood running cold. The sound was unlike anything she'd ever heard, a mix of anger and something almost intelligent. Max's hackles rose, and he positioned himself between Miriam and the source of the noise. "We need to go," Miriam whispered, tugging on Max's collar. But he didn't budge. His gaze remained fixed on the darkness ahead, his body coiled like a spring. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the growl stopped. The woods fell silent once more, save for the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Miriam exhaled shakily. "Come on, Max," she urged. This time he obeyed, though his steps were hesitant. As they made their way back to the house, Miriam's mind raced. Whatever she had called upon, it was no longer confined to her home. It had awakened something far older, something that had been waiting for a reason to rise. And now, there was no turning back. Whispers in the shadows. The strange occurrences in Pinewood began to intensify as the days passed. Reports of eerie howls, glowing footprints, and shadowy figures in the woods became the talk of the town. People whispered about supernatural forces, their imaginations fueled by fear and curiosity. But for Officer Hart, the rumors only deepened his irritation. Sitting at his desk in the police station, Hart skimmed through a growing stack of complaints from residents. Missing pets, strange lights, and inexplicable sounds dominated the reports. He tossed the papers aside with a grunt. "This town's going crazy," he muttered to himself. Across the room, Officer Emily Clark, a younger and more empathetic member of the force, observed Hart's growing frustration. "Maybe you should take a look into it," she suggested cautiously. "It's not like this town is known for wild stories." Hart shot her a glare. "You believe this nonsense?" Clark hesitated. "I don't know, but people are scared. If we dismiss them, it'll only make things worse." Hart scoffed but didn't respond. Deep down, he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had lingered since his encounter with Miriam. At the edge of town, Miriam was busy reinforcing the protective wards around her property. She moved methodically, placing small bundles of herbs and symbols etched into wood at key points around her yard. Max followed her closely, his glowing eyes scanning the perimeter. "I didn't mean for this to spread," she murmured to herself. "I only wanted protection. Balance." As she worked, a knock at the front door startled her. Wiping her hands on her apron, she opened it to find Emily Clark standing on her porch. "Officer Clark," Miriam said cautiously. "What brings you here?" Emily offered a small smile, her posture unthreatening. "I wanted to check in. Some people have been talking about strange things happening around here." Miriam's heart sank. "And you think I have something to do with it?" "No," Emily said quickly, "but you've lived here a long time. I thought you might know if there's any truth to these stories." Miriam studied Emily for a moment. Unlike Hart, there was no malice in her eyes, only genuine concern. "Come in," she said, stepping aside. Inside, Miriam poured them each a cup of tea and sat across from Emily at the kitchen table. Max curled up at Miriam's feet, his ears twitching. "I don't know what's happening," Miriam began, carefully choosing her words, "but this town has always had its secrets. There's a history here older than any of us." Emily leaned forward, her interest piqued. "What kind of history?" Miriam hesitated. "The woods. They're not just trees and dirt. There's something ancient there, something that doesn't like to be disturbed. When people forget that, bad things happen." Emily's expression turned serious. "Are you saying the woods are responsible for what's been happening?" "I'm saying the balance has been upset," Miriam replied cryptically. "And until it's restored, things will only get worse." Emily frowned, trying to make sense of Miriam's words. "Is there anything I can do to help?" Miriam was taken aback by the offer. She studied Emily's face, searching for any sign of deceit, but found none. "Not yet," she said finally, "but if the time comes, I'll let you know." Emily nodded, sensing she wouldn't get more answers today. As she stood to leave, she glanced down at Max, who stared back at her with unnervingly intelligent eyes. "He's a beautiful dog," she said. "Thank you," Miriam replied. "He's more than just a pet." Emily smiled faintly and left, leaving Miriam to her thoughts. That night, Hart patrolled the outskirts of town, his annoyance bubbling into anger. He drove slowly along the wooded roads, the beam of his headlights cutting through the dense fog. His radio crackled with occasional updates from dispatch, but the streets were eerily quiet. As he turned down a narrow lane leading into the woods, his headlights caught movement on the side of the road. Slamming on the brakes, he squinted into the darkness. At first, he saw nothing, but then a pair of glowing eyes appeared, staring directly at him. "What the hell?" Hart muttered, reaching for his flashlight. He stepped out of the car and shone the light toward the eyes, revealing a large black dog standing motionless in the shadows. Its coat gleamed unnaturally, and its eyes seemed to pierce through him. "Go on, get out of here," Hart barked, waving the flashlight. The dog didn't move. Instead, it growled low and deep, the sound reverberating through the still night air. Hart felt a chill creep up his spine but refused to show fear. He reached for his baton, ready to chase the animal off, but before he could take another step, the dog turned and disappeared into the woods. Hart stood frozen, his heart pounding. The silence that followed was oppressive, broken only by the faint rustling of leaves. Shaking his head, he climbed back into his car and slammed the door. "This town's losing its mind," he muttered, pulling away. Unbeknownst to Hart, the dog had not truly left. Max watched him from the edge of the woods, his glowing eyes tracking the patrol car until it vanished into the distance. Then, with a low growl, he turned and trotted back toward Miriam's house, his mission clear. At home, Miriam sat in her dimly lit living room, flipping through an old leather-bound book. The pages were filled with arcane symbols and handwritten notes in faded ink. She paused on a section titled "Restoring the Balance" and read the passage carefully. "Each action disrupts and each choice requires payment," she murmured aloud. "But what if the cost is too great?" Max entered the room and sat beside her, his eyes meeting hers. Miriam closed the book and placed a hand on his head. "We've started something we can't stop, haven't we?" Max licked her hand gently, his presence a small comfort in the growing storm. Miriam sighed, her resolve hardening. If she couldn't undo what had been set in motion, she would have to find a way to control it before it was too late. The wrath unleashed. The air in Pinewood grew thick with tension as the strange occurrences escalated. Unexplainable power outages, livestock found lifeless without cause, and whispers of shadowy figures in the woods dominated every conversation. Fear had taken hold of the town, and fingers were beginning to point at Miriam. For Officer Hart, the rumors provided an opportunity to regain control. To him, this chaos needed a scapegoat, and Miriam was the perfect target. It was late evening when Hart, along with two junior officers, Emily Clark and Jason Murray, drove toward Miriam's house. Their orders, issued by a nervous Chief Garrison, were vague: investigate the disturbances and talk to Miriam. However, Hart's intentions went beyond a simple discussion. As the police cruiser pulled up to Miriam's property, the headlights illuminated her modest home and the dense trees surrounding it. Max appeared at the edge of the yard, his glowing eyes visible even through the dark. The dog's low growl carried across the cool night air. "That thing gives me the creeps," Murray muttered, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. Hart smirked, opening the car door. "It's just a dog," he said dismissively, stepping out. "Let's go." Emily hesitated, glancing at the imposing silhouette of Miriam's home. "We're just here to talk, right?" Hart didn't respond. He strode up the path toward the house, his hand resting on his holstered weapon. The other officers followed reluctantly, the unease among them palpable. Before Hart could knock, the door creaked open. Miriam stood in the doorway, her expression calm but wary. Behind her, Max sat motionless, his piercing eyes fixed on the officers. "Evening, Officer Hart," Miriam said evenly. "What brings you here?" "We're investigating some complaints," Hart replied, his tone laced with hostility. "People are saying strange things have been happening around town, and your name keeps coming up." Miriam's eyes narrowed slightly. "Strange things have been happening long before tonight, officer. Perhaps you're looking in the wrong place." "Don't play coy with me," Hart snapped, stepping closer. "Whatever you're doing here, it's scaring people, and I'm not leaving until I get answers." Miriam folded her arms, her composure unshaken. "And if I told you I'm just an old woman minding her own business?" Hart's patience snapped. "Enough games!" He shoved past her into the house, ignoring her protests. Emily and Murray exchanged uneasy glances before following him inside. The interior of Miriam's home was as unsettling as the rumors suggested. Shelves lined with jars of herbs and roots, candles burning in almost every corner, and strange symbols etched into wooden plaques created an air of mystery. Emily's eyes wandered to a large, ancient-looking book resting on a table, its pages open to a diagram of what appeared to be a ritual circle. "This is some witchy stuff," Murray muttered under his breath. Hart stormed into the living room, knocking over a stack of books as he moved. "What are you hiding here?" he demanded, turning to face Miriam. "Some kind of cult. A curse on the town." Miriam's calm demeanor began to crack. "I'm not hiding anything," she said, her voice steady but firm. "You're the one who's brought trouble to this town, officer, not me." Hart sneered. "Is that so? Then explain why every weird thing happening lately points back to you." Miriam opened her mouth to respond, but a deep, guttural growl interrupted her. Max had entered the room, his fur bristling and teeth bared. The air seemed to shift, growing heavier, almost oppressive. Hart instinctively reached for his gun. "Control your dog, or I will." Miriam stepped in front of Max, her voice rising. "You will not harm him." The tension was electric, and for a moment it seemed as if the situation would erupt into violence. Then suddenly the lights flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. In the pitch black, the sound of heavy breathing and shuffling footsteps filled the air. Emily fumbled for her flashlight, her hands shaking as she finally managed to switch it on. The beam illuminated the room just in time to catch Max standing in front of Miriam, his form seemingly larger, more menacing than before. "What the hell is going on?" Murray whispered, his voice trembling. Hart didn't answer. His focus was on Miriam, who now held a lit candle in one hand, the flickering flame casting eerie shadows across her face. "This is your doing," Hart accused, his voice loud and accusatory. "You're behind all of it." Miriam's eyes flashed with anger. "I warned you, officer. The balance has been upset and your actions have only made it worse." Before Hart could respond, a loud crashing sound came from outside. The officers turned toward the window, their flashlights revealing a scene of chaos. The trees surrounding the house swayed violently, despite the lack of wind. Shadows darted between the trunks, their movements too fast and unnatural to be human. Emily's heart pounded as she whispered, "What are those?" Miriam's voice cut through the fear. "They are the guardians of the forest. They come to restore what has been broken." Hart laughed bitterly. "Guardians? This is insane!" But as the shadows outside began to close in on the house, even he couldn't deny the mounting terror. Max barked fiercely, standing his ground as if preparing to defend Miriam at all costs. Suddenly the door burst open, and the shadows poured into the room like a living entity. Emily screamed as the darkness swirled around them, cold and suffocating. Murray dropped his flashlight, the beam spinning wildly across the floor. Hart raised his gun, firing blindly into the void. The sound of gunfire echoed, but it seemed to have no effect. The shadows continued to encircle them, their presence overwhelming. Miriam stood still amidst the chaos, her eyes closed as she whispered words in a language no one understood. The shadows recoiled slightly, their movements faltering as if in response to her incantation. "Leave this place," Miriam commanded, her voice rising above the cacophony. "Return to the forest where you belong." For a moment everything paused. The shadows hovered, uncertain, before retreating slowly out the door and into the night. The oppressive air lifted, and the room fell silent. The officers stood frozen, their breaths heavy and uneven. Hart lowered his gun, his face pale and drenched in sweat. What was that?" Miriam turned to him, her expression weary but resolute. "A warning. The forest doesn't forgive trespassers." Emily, her voice trembling, asked, "What do we do now?" Miriam glanced at Max, who wagged his tail faintly. "You leave," she said, "and pray that it's not too late to make amends." Hart glared at her but didn't argue. Without another word, he motioned for the others to follow him out. As they stepped into the cool night air, the weight of what they had witnessed settled heavily on them. Back inside, Miriam sank into her chair, her strength drained. She reached down to scratch Max behind the ears, murmuring, "They won't stop, will they?" Max leaned into her touch, his glowing eyes reflecting the flickering candlelight. The battle was far from over. A pact revealed. The quiet streets of Pinewood were anything but serene as whispers of the night's events spread like wildfire. The story of the forest's shadows, Officer Hart's recklessness, and the mysterious powers surrounding Miriam reached every corner of the town. People speculated endlessly. Was she truly a witch, or was there something even more ancient at play? Meanwhile, Hart sat alone in his dimly lit office at the precinct. The events at Miriam's house haunted him, replaying in his mind like a broken record. He stared at his reflection in the darkened window, the weight of his fear transforming into anger. "She did something," Hart muttered to himself. "She's behind all of this." His desk phone rang, pulling him out of his spiraling thoughts. It was Chief Garrison. "Hart," the chief's voice boomed, "I just got word that there's a petition going around to have you suspended. The town's furious." Hart's grip tightened on the receiver. "It's that woman. She's turning them against me." "Whatever's happening, we can't afford any more mistakes," Garrison warned. "Keep your head down until this blows over." Hart slammed the phone down, his blood boiling. He wasn't going to let an old woman and her dog ruin him. Later that evening, Hart made his way back to Miriam's house, this time alone. He carried a flashlight in one hand and a small flask in the other, the alcohol dulling his nerves but sharpening his resolve. He didn't plan to leave until he had answers. As he approached the house, the forest seemed alive again. The trees rustled, though the air was still and strange sounds echoed faintly in the distance. Hart swallowed hard but pressed on, his anger outweighing his fear. Max greeted him at the edge of the yard, his stance protective, and his glowing eyes locked on Hart. The dog growled low and steady, his teeth bared. "Out of my way, mutt," Hart snarled, stepping forward. "I've had enough of you." Max didn't move. The standoff lasted a few tense moments before the front door creaked open. Miriam stood on the porch, her face unreadable. "You're persistent," she said. Hart marched up to her, jabbing a finger toward her. "I want the truth. What are you hiding? Why does this town think you have some kind of pact?" Miriam's eyes narrowed. "You came all this way for answers, but I don't think you're ready to hear them." Hart's frustration erupted. "Enough with the riddles. Just tell me." Miriam studied him for a long moment before sighing. "Fine, but understand this, Officer Hart. Some truths cannot be undone." She motioned for him to follow her inside. The house felt even more foreboding than before, the flickering candlelight casting dancing shadows on the walls. Hart noticed a large circular symbol etched into the wooden floor in the center of the room. Symbols he couldn't understand surrounded it. "What is this?" he demanded. "This," Miriam said, gesturing to the symbol, "is a pact made long before you or I were born. The forest has always been alive, officer, but it needed a guardian to protect it from the greed of men. Generations ago, my family made that pact." Hart scoffed. "So you're some kind of protector? What does that have to do with the shadows, with whatever that was last night?" Miriam's expression hardened. "The forest fights back when it's threatened. Your actions, your cruelty, have upset the balance. The shadows you saw were its way of warning you." Hart shook his head, his disbelief mixed with anger. "This is madness. You expect me to believe the forest is some kind of sentient thing?" "I don't care what you believe," Miriam replied coldly. "But if you don't stop provoking it, the next warning won't be so merciful." As Miriam spoke, the room seemed to darken. A low, resonant hum filled the air, and the candles flickered wildly. Max growled, positioning himself protectively in front of Miriam. Hart's bravado faltered as he looked around. "What's happening?" "The forest knows you're here," Miriam said. "It senses your hostility." Suddenly, the hum grew louder, and the shadows in the room began to move. They coalesced into vague shapes, tall, looming figures with hollow, glowing eyes. Hart stumbled back, his hand instinctively reaching for his gun. "Don't!" Miriam warned sharply. "You'll only make it worse." Hart's grip on his weapon tightened, but he didn't draw it. The figures advanced, their presence suffocating until they stopped just feet away from him. "Leave," Miriam commanded, her voice firm and unwavering. "This is your last chance." The shadows seemed to hesitate, then dissipated, retreating into the corners of the room. The oppressive air lifted, but Hart was visibly shaken. "You don't scare me," he said, his voice unconvincing. "I'll figure out what's really going on here." Miriam stepped closer, her eyes piercing. "You've already seen enough to know the truth. The question is, will you learn from it, or will you continue down this path?" Hart didn't respond. He stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind him. But as he walked back to his car, the forest seemed to whisper around him, its message clear. This wasn't over. A reckoning in the forest. The following days in Pinewood were tense. Stories of Officer Hart's encounter at Miriam's house spread through the town, each retelling more exaggerated than the last. Some claimed he saw spirits, others swore he fled from shadowy figures. The town was divided. Some sided with Hart, dismissing the tales as nonsense, while others began to view Miriam and the forest with newfound reverence. Hart, however, was consumed by paranoia. He couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was watching him. At night he'd wake to the sound of rustling leaves and faint whispers, only to find nothing outside his window. His confidence, once unshakable, had turned into a fragile mask, barely concealing his growing fear. One evening, Hart sat in his dimly lit living room, a half-empty bottle of whiskey on the table beside him. He stared at his reflection in the darkened television screen, his mind replaying the events at Miriam's house. He couldn't shake the image of the moving shadows and Miriam's cryptic warning. "You'll only make it worse," her voice echoed in his mind. A sudden knock at the door jolted him from his thoughts. Hart grabbed his gun, his paranoia in full control, and cautiously approached the door. "Who's there?" he barked. "It's me," a familiar voice called. It was Chief Garrison. Hart opened the door to find the chief standing on the porch, his face stern. "We need to talk," Garrison said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "What's this about?" Hart asked, his voice edged with irritation. "People are talking," Garrison said, lowering his voice. "There's a lot of heat on the department because of you. That woman, Miriam, is stirring things up." Hart clenched his jaw. "She's manipulating everyone. I know she's hiding something, and I'm going to prove it." Garrison sighed, rubbing his temples. "Hart, listen to yourself. You sound unhinged. This isn't about her. It's about you. You need to let this go before you ruin yourself." But Hart couldn't let it go. The idea of Miriam and her supposed power gnawed at him, fueling his obsession. "I'm not stopping until I get to the bottom of this." Garrison stood, his patience worn thin. "If you keep this up, you'll be suspended. Or worse. Think about your career, Hart." The chief left, leaving Hart alone with his spiraling thoughts, his determination solidified into a dangerous resolve. If no one else was willing to confront Miriam, he would do it himself. That night, Hart drove to the edge of the forest, his headlights cutting through the darkness. The air was heavy, the usual sounds of crickets and distant owls eerily absent. He stepped out of the car, flashlight in hand, and marched toward Miriam's house. But as he approached, the forest seemed to close in around him. The trees, tall and gnarled, loomed overhead like silent sentinels. The path he had walked before felt unfamiliar, twisting and turning in ways that made no sense. "This is just a trick," Hart muttered to himself, gripping his flashlight tightly. "She's trying to scare me." The deeper he ventured, the more the forest seemed to come alive. Shadows darted between the trees, and whispers echoed all around him, though he couldn't make out the words. His heart raced, but he pushed forward. Finally, he reached a clearing where Miriam stood waiting, as if she had been expecting him. Max was at her side, his glowing eyes fixed on Hart. "You've come to destroy yourself," Miriam said, her voice calm but laced with sadness. Hart pointed his flashlight at her, his hand trembling. "I've come to put an end to this." "This isn't something you can end," Miriam replied. "The forest has judged you, Hart. It's only a matter of time." Hart raised his gun, aiming it at Miriam. "Enough with the riddles. Tell me what's going on," Max growled, stepping forward protectively, but Miriam held up a hand to stop him. She stared at Hart, her eyes filled with an unsettling mix of pity and defiance. "You've already lost," she said softly. Before Hart could respond, the forest erupted into chaos. Shadows emerged from every direction, their forms more distinct and menacing than before. They circled Hart, their hollow eyes glowing with an unnatural light. The ground beneath his feet trembled, and a deep guttural roar echoed through the clearing. Hart fired his gun wildly, the muzzle flashes briefly illuminating the night. But the bullets passed harmlessly through the shadows, as if they weren't there at all. "Stop fighting!" Miriam shouted over the chaos. "You're only making it worse." But Hart couldn't hear her. His fear had taken over completely. He dropped his gun and ran, blindly sprinting through the forest. The shadows pursued him, their whispers growing louder and more relentless. "Judgment," they seemed to say. "Judgment." Hart tripped and fell, landing hard on the forest floor. He scrambled to his feet, only to find himself face to face with a massive, shadowy figure, its glowing eyes boring into him. "Please," Hart begged, his voice barely a whisper. "I didn't mean to—" The figure loomed closer, and the whispers reached a deafening crescendo. Hart covered his ears and shut his eyes, waiting for the inevitable. But then, silence. When he opened his eyes, the shadows were gone, and the forest was still. Hart stumbled back to his car, his body trembling and his mind racing. He didn't understand what had happened, but he knew one thing for certain. He was no longer in control. As dawn broke, the forest returned to its usual quiet state. Miriam stood at the edge of the clearing, watching the rising sun. Max sat beside her, his ears perked and his eyes scanning the tree line. "It's done," Miriam said softly. "He won't be back." Max let out a low bark, as if in agreement. The forest had delivered its judgment, and though Hart had escaped with his life, he had been forever changed. Redemption and reflection. The aftermath of Hart's confrontation with the forest left Pinewood in a state of quiet reflection. Though the officer had returned from the woods, he was no longer the man the town knew. Hart filed for an early retirement the following week, citing stress and health reasons, but those who knew the full story understood that the forest had left its mark on him. He kept to himself after that, avoiding not just the woods, but any mention of Miriam or the strange events that had transpired. For Miriam, life in Pinewood remained peaceful, if not slightly more respected. The once whispered stories about her were now spoken openly, and while many continued to view her with suspicion, others began to see her as a protector rather than a threat. Her unwavering kindness, her connection with the forest, and her fierce love for Max became emblematic of something larger, a quiet power that demanded respect. One afternoon, a group of children from the town ventured into the outskirts of the forest. They approached Miriam's house cautiously, their faces full of curiosity rather than fear. Miriam greeted them with a warm smile, inviting them to sit under the large oak tree in her yard. Max wagged his tail, nuzzling the smallest child, who reached out a hesitant hand. The children listened intently as Miriam told them stories of the forest, not of its dangers, but of its beauty and wisdom. She spoke of the interconnectedness of all living things and the lessons that nature could teach if only people were willing to listen. "I don't control the forest," Miriam said, her voice soft but firm. "I only protect it, and in return, it protects us." The children nodded, their wide eyes reflecting both awe and understanding. They left her yard with a newfound respect for the forest and a promise to treat it with care. As the weeks passed, the town of Pinewood slowly began to change. The community came together to clean up neglected parts of the forest, planting new trees and clearing away debris. Miriam's influence extended beyond her yard, inspiring the townspeople to see the forest as a source of life rather than fear. Even those who had once doubted her began to see her differently. One day, the town's mayor approached Miriam, an olive branch in the form of a formal invitation. They wanted her to speak at the town's annual community day, a chance for her to share her perspective and bridge the gap between the town and the forest. "I'm not one for public speaking," Miriam said with a chuckle, but she agreed nonetheless. On the day of the event, She stood before the townspeople, Max at her side, and spoke from the heart. "We've all been afraid of what we don't understand," she began, "but fear doesn't have to divide us. If we approach the unknown with respect and kindness, we'll find that it often gives us more than we could ever imagine." The crowd erupted into applause, and for the first time, Miriam felt truly seen, not as a mystery or an outsider, but as part of the community. The legend of Pinewood's forest continued to grow, but its tone had shifted. It was no longer a story of fear and superstition, but one of respect, humility, and the power of second chances. Visitors came from nearby towns, drawn by the tales of a mysterious woman and her faithful dog who had once stood against the darkness and emerged stronger. Miriam lived out her days quietly, tending to her garden, caring for Max, and watching over the forest she loved. The whispers about her never truly disappeared, but she didn't mind. She knew the forest would always have its secrets, and that was as it should be. To those who stayed until the end of this tale, thank you for joining us on this journey. If you found this story as compelling as we did, don't forget to like this video and comment below. What would you have done in Hart's position? Do you believe the forest's judgment was fair? Your thoughts are what keep this community growing, so don't forget to subscribe and share this story with someone who loves a good mystery. Together, we can ensure that stories like this reach more people and spark meaningful conversations. Disclaimer: the content of this video is entirely fictitious and does not reflect reality or encourage negative behaviors.